This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
This is the Talking Animal Law podcast, brought to you every 2 weeks by the UK Centre for Animal Law and hosted by Paula Sparks, Director of A-Law. But it's not just for lawyers, it's for anyone who cares about animals. So no matter who you are, if you want to know more about animal protection, news, ethics and animal law reform, then this is the podcast for you.
Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Talking Animal Law. We take a different approach in this episode, which is the first in a series of interviews about theology, animals and law. Recognising that theology has had a profound influence on the shaping of ancient law and continues to inform and influence societal values, law and contemporary debate issues, we'll be exploring attitudes towards animals across major religions. In this episode, we explore attitudes to animals in Orthodox Christianity, and today I'm talking to Dr. Christina Nellist, an Eastern Orthodox theologian specialising in animal suffering and human salvation. Dr. Nellist is a former visiting research fellow at Winchester University, a guest lecturer on veterinary ethics at Chile's Iberia America University, and advisor to the government, receiving an award for her work on stray dog control via public health education. Finally, she is a fellow at the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics and now president of the Pan-Orthodox Concern for Animals. And she's writing 2 books, Climate Crisis and Creation Care, Historical Perspectives, Ecological Integrity and Justice, and Climate Crisis and Creation Care, Integrated Theology, Governance and Justice. I'm really pleased to speak to her today. Welcome, Christina. Thank you for coming to talk to us today.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's a real pleasure. So we're obviously talking animal law. So can you help us with the question of why we're talking about theology on a law podcast? How has the Christian doctrine shaped law in Western societies, do you think?
Well, I think firstly, it's widely recognised that most of our laws were or are influenced and guided by an acceptance of Christian teachings, a Christian ethics framework, if you will, but also that the Hebrew scriptures are included as the Old Testament. So the famous 10 commandments found in Exodus 20 were adopted by Christians. So we're not to kill, commit adultery, steal, bear false witness, etc. They are also defined as sins and sinful behaviour. It is important to note, I think, that it does not say do not kill animals. Do not kill humans. It says we are not to kill.
Right.
And I think that's important for us in our work. But these specific laws were also set within that wider ethical framework that we still have today, you know. Well, maybe not so much, but even so, honour God, remember the Sabbath, honour your parents and elders and so forth. So a good, orderly, structured society. But I would like to make an important point on one of those commandments, because the very first commandment, people won't know, is thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's Exodus 23. And this is very important for understanding the story of Noah and thus sin. Sin is not confined to what we do to humans. It is also sinful to harm animals, to be indifferent to the suffering of animals, and to commit harm even in ignorance. And so I would ask your audience, mainly lawyers, I suppose, to look at Genesis 8:21. Which is what God says. And he says this after Noah's actions in Genesis 8:20. It's literally the next phrase. Now, Noah only performs 2 acts when he leaves the ark. He builds an altar and he kills the animals in sacrifice. And so look at what God says immediately after this violence. It isn't about smelling the sweet aroma and giving us animals to eat, as you often hear. Not a bit of it. God reflects on Noah's actions and states very clearly that evil continues to exist in the human hearts and minds. We can only conclude, therefore, it was the destruction, the violence to the animals that God had instructed Noah to save that brought the recognition of continued evil and sin in humans. And I suppose the second thing I would have to say is that theologians also have a very important role to play in understanding the laws on personhood, for example. But for that discussion, we need to go back to Trinitarian theology and the Emperor Justinian. So I'll leave that for the moment, as I know you want to talk to me about the recent Amici Curiae brief for Appy the elephant.
I do. I'm very interested in talking to you about that. Just sticking for the moment with ancient history, we know that the Romans and the early Christians saw animals as created for the use of mankind. What do you say to the argument that God actually put animals on earth for our benefit, and so it's permissible to cause them suffering if that benefits humankind?
Okay. Well, firstly, I can say without any doubt that this is bad theology and bad philosophy. The utilitarianism that's so full of errors and abhorrent to Christian ethicists. The Christian God did not create any creature to suffer. In Genesis, God is clear. All created beings were to live in peaceful harmony, with no death or killing, and provided all with a vegan or vegetarian diet as the ideal. Violence to any creature is against God's will. If we ignore, so in a wider context, if we ignore any form of violence, the manifestation of evil in theological terms, we allow other forms to grow. So instead, we are to reflect the image of an all-loving and compassionate God who does not want any of his creatures to suffer. So therefore, we need to interrogate where this false premise comes from. So answering firstly within a theological framework, I can say that after the fall of Adam and the later fall of Noah, yes, there were two falls, early societies were brutal to their human and non-human conquests. And we have detailed historical commentary on pre-games animal abuse and the killing of animals and humans for fun, sport, and spectacle. Two examples are Ovid, who in Fasti gives details of foxes being set on fire in honor of Ceres, and Pliny. Pliny gives a lot of information in his natural history on details of circus fights, elephants and tiger hunting, and of vast areas of the world being void of animals that were taken for the game. So, you know, we can associate that with modern day hunting. The Christian commentary against this type of abuse can be found in many teachings, such as those from, let's say, St. Irenaeus in the 2nd century, who refers to the games as hateful spectacles, where the soteriological implications of salvation of humans are clear. He says, that bloody spectacle, hateful both to God and men, in which gladiators either fight with wild beasts or singularly encounter each other. And from St. John Chrysostom in the 4th century, who gives similar teaching about the games, describing those who go to that spectacle as the devil's captive. So these teachings have obvious relevance for contemporary issues such as circuses, zoos, and hunting. And sticking with those ancients, we also have the influence of the Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle. And here I'm talking more about the hierarchical structure of society that we still live with today, where, well, not so much, but certainly in some cultures, with the elite men at the top, women and lesser men below, followed by children, slaves, and animals. Women were not capable of higher level reasoning, and because these philosophers believed that non-human animals were devoid of language, they were therefore incapable of thought, and thus defined as irrational creatures whose purpose was to serve humans. And interestingly, according to Aristotle, the souls of slaves, which were humans, were nonetheless equal to that of the souls of non-human animals. Now, the majority of senior theologians of the early church were educated in the great philosophical schools And thus they were steeped in this mindset of that time. So we can't blame them for being influenced. But it's only by the grace of God and the incarnation of Christ, talking here as a Christian ethicist, that love and compassion, a new type of life was available, one with love and compassion at its core. However, this influence of the Greek philosophy, both in the social structure and its teachings, which denied moral concern and salvation to animals, is still evident in contemporary societies. And whilst the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s kicked against this hierarchical structure, like women's lib and so on, there is still much to do, especially in the field of animal protection, theology and philosophy. And then thirdly, the contemporary science disproves much of Aristotelian science, which remarkably lasted until quite recent times. Contemporary science informs us that many species of animals have language, intellect, self-awareness, memory, family units, the ability to feel pain and joy, etc. And this sentience fulfills the criteria of those early philosophical definitions of rational beings who can suffer. So we as theologians, scientists and lawyers must continue to fight such ignorant beliefs on their behalf.
That's really interesting, and it ties in with another area that I wanted to ask you about, which is this concept of dominion. And as I understand it, this is an important aspect of Christian teaching. So does the Orthodox Christian faith accept that we have, as humans, dominion over animals, and so we can use them for our benefit? And if that is the prevailing thinking, is your view different from that, and therefore how is it different?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is correctly define the term dominion. The problem arises from its historical interpretation. The modern Eastern Orthodox scholarship accepts that the past interpretation of dominion as domination is an error, as it fails to recognize God's constraints on human freedom and ignores the blueprint of God as archetype. And I agree with that. The Western view of dominion is due to that mistranslation and misinterpretation of the word used in the Bible.
Right.
The correct interpretation is more akin to a kingly lord or king, the protector of life, not the destroyer of life. And I think it best to quote a senior Orthodox theologian on this very point, which is taken from our interview in 2014, from my book on Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Animal Suffering, Ancient Voices in Modern Theology. Now, Metropolitan Callistos of Dioclea was a patron of my charity, Pan-Orthodox Concern for Animals, and a senior Orthodox theologian loved and adored around the word. And he says, and I quote, "It is said that we are to have dominion as humans over the created order, but dominion does not mean domination or ruthless tyranny. This domination that humans are given is part of being in God's image. So what this means is that just as God cares for his creation and loves it, so we, after the image of God, are to care and love creation. This, to me, is the basic position of the Orthodox Church in regard to animals." So this teaching does reflect the Orthodox understanding, which stands in stark contrast to another flawed teaching exemplified by St. Aquinas, but harking back to St. Augustine and Aristotle, who taught that the irrationality of animals indicates that their only value lies in their use. And again, I quote, "Animals set themselves in motion by a kind of natural impulse, a sign of which is that they are naturally enslaved and accommodated to the use of others." And that's Aquinas. and so heavily influenced the Western Christian tradition. Today in Orthodoxy, we challenge that. We reject that, actually. We don't challenge it, we reject it. And in Orthodoxy and in other religions now, we tend to hear phrases such as till and keep, or stewardship, and priests of creation. For we have at last begun to understand how our ignorance, our arrogance and pride has brought about an increasingly unstable climate and destruction to vast areas of the earth, our oceans, rivers and air, polluted air. The biodiversity of our planet has plummeted and continued life on the planet is in jeopardy. We require fundamental changes in the hearts of humankind, and this is where theology, modern theology, has a special role to play by encouraging humans to see the sacredness of all creatures rather than viewing them as mere resources.
Well, that's interesting. And as if we've looked back in order to understand where we are now. So how does theology today help us to navigate those contemporary ethical issues that can be quite difficult to navigate when there are different interests at play, such as the use of animals in scientific research, other issues? How does this help us?
I think, firstly, it's important to say that Christian ethicists and theologians must involve themselves in this horrendous subject and other forms of animal suffering. It is difficult and heartbreaking when we read and know what goes on. But if we're truly to be priests of creation and to reflect the image of God, we must have the courage to stand against these evil practices. And I do not use that term lightly. Metropolitan Callistos uses this term even for the animal food industries, the industrial food program. He calls them evil. So I'm on solid ground here. We know that God does not create anything to suffer or to create disposable lives. Each individual sparrow or the sea urchin is cared for by God, so the Bible and the early fathers teach us. All things are good and very good and are blessed and in covenant with God. So if God cares for the sea urchin, we must conclude that he also cares for the animals in zoos, circuses and laboratories. God is also all-powerful. So we must now ask if this methodology, thinking about animal experimentation, is this the best he could come up with? Is this the best God could devise? And the answer is no, clearly no. This suffering is against God's will. Now, I've written at length on this animal experimentation subject, asking the Orthodox Church to examine its teachings and reflect on their position. And you will find a very detailed exposition of this in chapter 9 of my first book mentioned earlier. I used to teach the sciences and I understand what is involved. I'm on the board of the Animal Interfaith Alliance and on its steering committee on animal experimentation. Last year, I was invited to the FOCAE Theological School to give a lecture on my work with animals and Orthodox theology to our Pope, His All Holiness the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, various Orthodox hierarchs, clergy, and students on an MA course at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens on animal welfare, ethics, and law. The Hellenic Pasteur Institute were also there, and as they experiment on animals, I included objections to the use of animals for experimentation in my lecture in front of the Pope. And I will give some of the same facts to you, Paula, as I gave to our Pope and clergy, as I'm sure many of your listeners will not know them. Firstly, the failure rate of the animal testing model, the failure rate is between 92 and 97%. These figures were given in 2004 by the US Food and Drug Administration, the organization that licenses drugs. That such a conservative organization would make such figures public indicate the concern they had at the time, for this failure rate clearly endangers human health. Of those drugs that do make it to market, many are withdrawn due to the harm, even death, to humans. And at the end of last year, the US House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly, I can't remember the numbers, it was something like hundreds, 200-300 of votes to 30 or thereabouts, to remove the statutory obligation to test on animals. And this would not have been done if the animal testing model was effective in advancing human health. The second argument I would give against that is the use of these scales of suffering, such as those outlined in the EU classifications of mild, moderate, or severe. Such scales, to quote Lindsay, are used to defend the indefensible. And I liken this to issues of violence to women that I've also had dealings with. If a woman is hit by her husband's fist, her suffering, we could argue, is less than those in other countries where I've lived, where women are set on fire or have acids thrown in their faces. But the key point is that the woman who is hit by her husband's fist still suffers. It is wrong. Same is true of animals. So the animals in a cage in a zoo suffer, and their suffering is against the will of God. All suffering is wrong, and is an indication, a red flag, as we call now, that we are behaving against the will of God, against goodness, against kindness, compassion, and love. We are on the wrong path, and that 92 to 97% failure rate shows us by how much.
I mean, there's a lot to pick apart there that we probably don't have time for today, but it's really good to have your perspective and to have your thoughts from a theological point of view about practices that perhaps we might just accept because they're normal. We're told that actually this is necessary for human health. So it's really, really good to hear that perspective on the other side. And going to the future now and the vision for the future, I know that you did recently write an amicus curiae brief for the Non-Human Rights Project in the United States, whose lawyers are trying to secure the release of certain captive wild animals. So again, I'd be really interested on your perspective for the future and how Orthodox theology is relevant to this particular issue.
Well, I think certainly it is, and I think we had some good, we had a relatively good outcome. The first time we had 2 judges find in our favour, and I would like to think that my perspective was so different that it actually asked them, or maybe it challenged them to rethink the whole premise. So I think firstly, theology helps us to identify the error of using the term person for humans. Now, this must have made them sit up and think. I decided to contest the entire premise of the personhood for animals argument, which seems never-ending and with no positive outcome for non-human animals. So I constructed 4 separate but complementary arguments using Trinitarian theology, Emperor Justinian's codification of Roman law, the philosophical tool of false dilemma, and Aristotle's flawed science. And so that's too much for today. So I just concentrate on the main point of how Trinitarian theology explains how the word person should not have been ascribed exclusively to humans or used to distinguish between or separate human beings from non-human beings. So in theological terms, the contemporary use of the term person for human beings is fundamentally in error. It is a misuse of the term. Person was and is only applicable to the 3 persons of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In our earliest doctrine, which is sung every Sunday in its various forms of the Creed, human beings are created beings, not persons. And I argue that human exceptionalism can only be used in reference to the image of God, which is not said of other animals. It's only said of the humans. So our exceptionalism can only be used in terms of image of God, not in discussions on person or personhood. Now, to explain the significance of this point to the court, I explained the role of the emperors of New Rome, who were also heads of the Christian Church. Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, in 527, or 5 to 565, was his reign, reformed the government, which had long suffered from corruption, and codified centuries of legislation and outmoded Roman laws. And we refer to that as the Codex Justinianus. He and the subsequent emperors would have known that St. Athanasius, St. Basil the Great, St. Gregory of Nyssa, and St. Gregory Nazianzen succeeded in formulating the Christian doctrine of God and the Trinity. The early theological challenge was to discern the language and categories that would describe the antinomic nature of God's being as Trinity, as simultaneously one and many. In simple terms, 3 in 1. I'm sure you've heard that.
Yeah.
So, as was commonplace at that time, the early church fathers drew from those Greek philosophical categories, and they selected hypostasis and ousia. The Trinitarian doctrine uses the term person, which in Greek is hypostasis, only for the 3 persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. This points to what is irreducibly unique to each of the 3 persons, i.e., the Father is not the Son. The Son is not the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is not the Father. They're unique hypostasis. The other term, ousia, indicates that which is attributable to all 3 persons of the Trinity. The same stuff, if you like, the same essence. They all have this commonality. So we can argue, therefore, that historically the use of the word person to either human beings or non-human beings is both theologically and in legal context fundamental errors. So then what do I do? So I then have to square the circle. Having deconstructed the argument, I then have to reconstruct it then in more modern terms. And so I contextualize the argument for today using modern Orthodox teachings, noting that person can be applied to humans, for as image of God, they are called to personalize all creation. So what do I mean by that? So in this context, person means the irreducible uniqueness that is realized as a relational event. So to personalize creation means to facilitate relational patterns that manifest the irreducible, again, that irreducible uniqueness of all living entities, including animals. So in terms that you and I would understand, your audience would understand, that we have an I and thou in relationship and in communion, rather than an I and an it.
Wow.
So in summary, I argued that if the court wishes to use the term person as opposed to the term ousia to denote the sameness of the being of the animal kingdom, as opposed to, example, the sameness or ousia of the individual creatures in the plant kingdom, logically, they must right the legal errors in the Justinian Codex and use the same term for both human animals and non-human animals, because contemporary science informs us that they are constituted of the same ousia, the same stuff. They are all animals regardless of their species. They are not objects or things. So that's the basic argument that I put forward. It's a complicated one. And no doubt the Greeks will kick up because it's more complicated, those 2 terms. But nonetheless, it is right. Person can be applied because they are the same. They are they cannot use persons, because we only use persons for the three persons of the Trinity.
And it takes us back, doesn't it, Christina, I think, to what you had said at the beginning of our discussion about the fact that enslaved people were regarded in the same category at times.
That's right.
As non-human persons, because we know that person has been limited to human persons, but hasn't historically always included all people, and so enslaved people were excluded from the definition of person. And we also know today, don't we, that person can include artificial persons, can include companies, and so on. So we have human persons, and we also have non-human persons, but we don't have non-human animals. And you can see that through the history, I think.
And that's right. And when we look at it in those terms, we see the stupidity of it. But of course, philosophers and most theologians, unlike myself, are far too polite. I think we need to call it out. We philosophers and to an extent theologians, we do love to complicate issues. I mean, I can give you the theology of creation. God is love. That's it. Three words. We don't need to say anything else, but of course we do. But we can take this right back to really simple stuff. Humans and non-human animals are the same essence. We're made of the same stuff. Now, of course, we can argue we're all made up of stardust, but then that's a different, that would be a different one. And we can see the fathers even talking about that in discussions on essence and energies. We're all filled with the spark of the divine, if you like. Well, hello, this is what our physicists are more or less telling us now. So there's a huge amount of that theology can open for discussion, but in our terms, lawyers need to keep on at the courts to change their understanding. And this incorrect interpretation of person and personhood, it comes from Boethius. He was the link between the ancient world and the modern. He was in charge of the legal system in the time of Justinian's reformation of the Roman law. And he translated all the works of Plato and Aristotle. He translated them from the Greek into Latin. So this man was an avid lover of Greek philosophy. And like the early church fathers, who are both the Catholic and the Orthodox, both had the same fathers at that time. It wasn't until the millennium that they split on another text that really is more to do with, I think, again, semantics more than the theology and politics. Mm-hmm. And so we don't know how much of the politics is. But of course, we all know how vested interests have determined laws, politics, and even some might argue theology, especially in so many of these modern classifications of Christianity, which we see as cults, and we would determine as cults in our traditional Orthodox faith. It's used to get money, provide money for individuals or groups of individuals. Prosperity gospel nonsense that we hear today. And I don't have to tell you, you could give me chapter and verse of the ridiculous laws that exist today in our legal systems. You quite rightly just refer to them, or make inference to them. And so we have to challenge this stuff and say, enough of this Aristotle nonsense. Let's start now. Let's look at what reality is, not this. Aristotle believed, because when he couldn't work out how an animal came into being, he simply said, that they spontaneously came into being. They just, like that, they just existed. I mean, that's a nonsense. We wouldn't accept that today. He believed in a flat earth. We wouldn't accept that today. And yet the fathers did, because that was the prevailing, they were the prevailing thoughts of their time, and that was the science of their time. I mean, Aristotle lasted up until late 18th century, I think, before he started to be questioned. He had no idea of the scientific method. So much of his stuff is just so wrong. He had, maybe you should cut this out, Paula, but he had no idea of what his scrotum was for. You know, he thought the male voice lowered in pitch as that got a particular area of his anatomy got lower. He had no idea of what hormones were. We can't blame him for that. But nonetheless, you know, he based a lot of his science on that sort of understanding. Nonsense. Teenage boys know more than that of today.
Well, I think a good place to end is what you had said just a few minutes ago, that God is love, and it gives us all some hope for the future and a guiding principle going forward as to how we should shape our society.
Yes, indeed. I totally agree with that, Paula. And thank you again for giving me this great opportunity. It was lovely. And also to engage with your lovely doggy, who is now full of dog chews.
Yes, she is.
You and your dog.
I am keeping her quiet. Thank you, Dr. Christina Nellist. It's been amazing talking to you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I really appreciate your time. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening from. And if you give us a good review, it will help others to find us. And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss a show.
For more information about the work of the UK Centre for Animal Law, please go to www.alaw.org.uk.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's iroarpod.com.